Go.
Hi everyone, it's Miss Wan, Miss Harrison and Mrs Marshall here, talking to you about inspector calls again. We're on lesson 4 this week, and this is the lesson where we're going to look at the inspector's introduction and his juxtaposition to the majority of the Berlins. This week we're going to be focusing mainly on his interaction with Berlin and how those two characters juxtapose each other.
Okay, so...
sorry.
Sorry, Miss Harris, you did such a good job, and there's just me interrupting. Off you go.
So we're going to be focusing, like I said, on the introduction of the inspector, his stage directions, which are really, really important to get some key analysis on, which we'll be looking at in a little bit. And like I said, his initial interaction with the Berlin family, mainly Mr. Berlin. So at this point in the play, what you should have already read up to is Mr. Berlin and his capitalist rant that we looked at in last week's lesson, looking at how his views of the world and how he thinks that everyone should look after themselves, essentially. So he's deliberately presented as being foolish through the use of dramatic irony used by Priestley. He's talked about that there's no chance of a war, that the Titanic's unsinkable. And again, remember that while it's set in 1912, it's performed to a 1945 audience who would have known that this was a load of rubbish. So again, we are set up to dislike these characters through their arrogance and their kind of inability to see anything beyond their own means. So we're looking at, in this lesson, how does the inspector behave towards the Berlins, and maybe why does he? The inspector is the voice, the mouthpiece of J.B. Priestley. Priestley's views are coming through the inspector. So how does he behave towards them? And more importantly, why does he behave towards them in this way? So that's what we're going to be covering in this in today's lesson.
Brilliant. Thank you, Miss Harris. I'm just going to move on to our first quote, which is the introduction of the inspector and the way that J.B. Priestley chooses to use the stage directions to help the director think about how they might want to present the inspector to the audience.
Woo. Is the PowerPoint on?
Yes, it is.
Yay! Sorry, it wasn't on mine.
That's okay.
Can everyone still see us or not?
I've taken you all off. Can you see
bye.
them?
Yeah, we're in business. Okay, hi everybody. The first stage direction then of the bit that we're focusing on today. You can see it up on your screen now. I can now see it on mine. The inspector enters and Edna goes, closing the door after her. The inspector need not be a big man, but he creates at once an impression of massiveness, solidity and purposefulness. He is a man in his 50s, dressed in a plain, darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So last week we touched a little bit on the importance of Edna and why we thought it might be significant that Priestley would choose the servant character, a working class woman like Edna, to actually have the inspector come into the room or come into the household of the Berlins. Obviously she is the servant, so it would have been traditional that she would come in, interrupt and say, please sir, there's somebody, an inspector's called. But also the fact that she's the one that opens the door for him and allows him in, you could interpret this symbolically as showing how this working class character ushers in a new thinking of socialism, which is embodied in the inspector, a new socialist influence into the play, into this capitalist household. So moving on then, the inspector need not be a big man, but he creates a big impression. And there's these three words here, the massiveness, the solidity, and the purposefulness that we're going to talk about a little bit now. So what do we think, Miss Swan and Miss Harrison? Why does he need to create the impression of massiveness?
Miss Harrison, did you want to go first?
Yeah. I love this quote for the inspector. I think, in my opinion, he creates this massive impression. I'm going to zoom in on that word massiveness, if you don't mind, for a second. Yeah. He creates this massive impression, particularly on the younger characters. Instantaneously, we're going to look at that a little bit later, when Sheila kind of pipes up in Act 1 and kind of, rebukes her father's statement that, Berlin doesn't say it, but it's Berlin's belief that the women in his factory that are employed by him are cheap labour. I'm going to come on to that in a second. But, the big character so far in the play has been Berlin. And when the inspector comes in, he's kind of stopped in his tracks by the inspector. He creates a massive impression. He's solid. So he's kind of this, it's almost like the inspector's an immovable object. And Berlin so far has been this unstoppable force, and it's kind of almost like these clash of the titans almost in this initial meeting. And Berlin kind of regresses almost, I would say. Not regress, that's the wrong word, but kind of he kind of sinks into himself the more the inspector speaks. And the inspector very much takes charge of the situation, the dining room, and certain family members, i.e. Eric and Sheila, the more that is revealed about Eva Smith. Miss Wan, have you got anything to add?
Yeah, I really like the idea that you've zoomed onto the abstract noun massiveness, because I think looking at the idea of why is it not necessarily important that the inspector is this massive physical presence. And I think most of it is, like you said, this idea of the authority of the inspector coming from his moral stance that he's going to deliver to the Burlings. And when we look at this idea of him being this, like you said, massive, immovable object, it's almost the forcefulness of what he is about to reveal to the Burlings is going to shatter their sort of fragile comfort. I was thinking about what Mrs. Marshall said earlier about Edna being that person that opens the door to the inspector. It's almost like even the idea that she introduces this idea of socialism, I'd really like this idea of the door opening and sort of them being exposed in this protected space that they had of their dining room and their house and their own world is being, again, I think I've said this word before, but it's being violated by the inspector, but for good reason as well, because of the fact that he believes that it's really important that the Burlings understand about the consequences of their actions and how they impact their own community. Is there anything else to add before we move on?
Yeah, fab. So I think what we've all said is really that it's the words really are about his metaphorical impact rather than necessarily about the character himself or the actor that plays him in terms of how they need to look. What is really clear is in his own purpose as a playwright as well. And so that kind of the importance and the weight, if we're going to zoom in a bit later in a minute, lower down on that adverb weightily, it's about the weight of his message and the fact that there is a sense that he's there for a reason and a duty. He's there to fulfill something in terms of what he's trying to draw out of this. The Burlings, now that they are weakened, now that they are exposed, is going to try and shatter the world that they've made for themselves.
So I just want to draw one point about the darkish suit, I guess. I think it's interesting because I think in some ways it contrasts with what Priestley says about what the Burlings wear at the start, about the expensive evening wear. And and I think that's something there that shows that he's, in some ways, it's quite a sort of evident that they may have differences just through what they wear.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think as well. Sorry.
No, go for it.
I think as well with what you've just said about the Berlins wearing, you know, the fashion of the period. That's all a facade to cover up, you know, the kind of emotional instability within the family. Whereas the inspector really, metaphorically and symbolically, he hasn't got anything to hide. He's there to like Mrs. Marshall's already said, deliver a message. So he's not that's not what he's about putting on airs and graces and impressing these people. His duty is to kind of be the mouthpiece of the little guy, of the Eva Smiths of the world, and kind of put these people on a pedestal and say, look at what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good start on the introduction, Inspector. Like we said, really important to focus on the stage directions and the choices that Priestley makes about the presentation of the characters. We're going to move on to our first key quote, and at this point, just going to fast forward a little bit. The inspector has revealed to Mr. Burling that Eva Smith was one of his employees that he had fired from the factory because she was one of the, was it five girls?
Yeah.
That decided to go on strike because they wanted a pay rise. And so to reduce the trouble in his opinion that they were causing, he fires the main culprits of that, and he believes Eva Smith to be one of them. So we're at this point, and I'll just quickly go through. The inspector goes, "It's my duty to ask questions," and Mr. Burling responds, "Well, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. If I'd agreed, we'd have added 12% to our labour costs, so I refused. We were paying the usual rates, and if they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else." I think when I was looking at this quote for today's session, I thought the first thing it's quite interesting is that they both use the word duty. So they parallel in the sense of using that word, but the meaning behind it, I think the intention behind it is very different. And I think when we look at the inspector and Mr. Burling, we start to see this idea of them inspector being the antithesis of Mr. Burling, which, in case you want to do more revision, is the person that's direct opposite of someone in a text. Okay, so they are contrasting. So Miss Harrison said last week that she likes to look at the definitions of words, and that's something I like to do with my classes as well, just to get an idea of whether we can push for those alternatives. So when I reviewed the idea of the abstract noun duty, it said that it was a moral or legal obligation and a responsibility. But I think when we look at the inspector, Mr. Burling, they use it in very different ways. So when the inspector looks at this idea of my duty, he represents socialism. Okay, he represents this idea that one of the ideas of socialism, that you think about the greater well-being of the community. So in his idea is that when he's there to defend Eva Smith and to sort of get the truth out of the Burlings, okay, he wants the Burlings to see actually that they had a role in Eva Smith's death, and later on as we go through the sessions we'll probably talk about in more depth about Eva being a symbol of the wider working class. Okay, so he believes that he represents this idea of the protection of the community and their well-being. But Mr. Burling's idea of duty is completely different. Okay, he thinks that he's responsible to, you know, in terms of keeping capitalism going and making sure that he profits from, even if it means at the expense of paying people very little. And so because he says, if I'd agreed, we've added 12% to our labour costs, his main priority is to make sure that he can maximise his profit. But like we said in the last session, when we looked at Mr. Burling in more depth, okay, he's all about benefiting. this whole environment shows how he has benefited from those that have suffered. Okay, so I think it's interesting because the first person pronoun, I'd, if he'd agreed, if he actually made that choice, then there'd be people that would have had possibly a better way of a quality of life. But he's decided to suppress these individuals from having a better quality of life. So I think he doesn't really see duty in the moral sense. It's more of a financial duty, okay, that he performs as part of his job as this factory owner. It's interesting actually, because the idea that he flippantly says that if they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. It's almost like with the pronouns there, the I and the they, that exclusive pronoun, almost pits them up against each other, as opposed to recognizing naturally they're in a community that should be helping, like I said, everybody for the greater well-being. And as we said in our last session, and as you can see that we're pulling information from the last sessions, that it all kind of comes together when we think about the ideas that Priestley puts through, that the audience in 1945 would have actually seen a breaking down of social class barriers due to the rationing systems in place and the war effort, where people came together, and actually they would have been of the belief that it would be better to work for the community as to opposed to your own individual interests. And so I think in this sense, Mr. Burling represents a very, very traditional mindset of the 1912 era, okay, which is that is designed to not make the class system socially mobile, and but that's only because it allows him to make more money. Is there anything to add to that, Mrs. Marshall and Miss Harrison?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I absolutely love your dual analysis of the word duty there, and how I think you're absolutely right, the way it's used very differently by the two different characters. And I think that would be a lovely focal point of an exam response, to just look at those two different definitions and how Mr. Burling, as you've said, thinks of his duty in a much more self-serving sense. And also what you said about the fact that he constructs this sort of ideology, as they all do in the play. Miss Harrison talked earlier about them sort of putting on airs and living behind this kind of facade in what they wear. But there's also an ideology that they all buy into in the play, which is essentially what Priestley's trying to shatter. And it's this idea that it's all right for them to be upwardly mobile, but not for the working classes. There's this double standard all the way through the play, where they protect themselves and their own interests, and they're so self-serving in the way that they do that. And in for a 1945 audience, where the welfare state would have just come in, and if you can't remember from your revision of last time, remember the welfare state was when things like the NHS was first introduced, and there were minimum wages. There would have been no minimum wage at that time, and so that might be an important contextual point to bring in, on top of what Miss Warner said about they could go and work somewhere else. It's implying that there's an element of choice, and Priestley's really clever there in this quote from Mr. Burling, because he's sort of suggesting that, well, if they don't like it, they can go elsewhere. But there isn't that choice for these women, and the factories where they wouldn't have had a minimum wage. There isn't necessarily an alternative for them, but they're sort of protecting themselves by sort of buying into this ideology that, well, they can do what they want, they can go elsewhere if they don't like it, but it's all really subtly about protecting themselves and their own interests, which I'll come on to a bit more in my quote. Go on.
Yeah, sorry, Mrs. Marshall. I was just thinking about something that's sprang to my mind when you said that. And actually, when we think about when he talks about this, he's actually making it applicable to Eva Smith. And I think, again, we'll probably go into this more depth, but she's actually an unmarried woman. Yeah, young woman. And actually, there would have been very few options for her, because she would have been dependent on her husband to be the one that was making financial decisions. Whilst it's not such an odd thing for people to remain single now, a single unmarried woman would have been something that would have not only been seen as, I guess, maybe unusual for the time, but actually had a lot of sort of implications in terms of the lifestyle you would have had. So actually, when we think about they could go and work somewhere else, there would have been very limited options for an unmarried woman.
Yeah,
I think.
Yeah.
So we'll go on to the next quote, which is Miss Marshall's chosen this one for you guys to focus on.
Fab. So yeah, it ties in nicely from what we've just been saying, really. So in the next little part of the play, then obviously Mr. Burling gets his grilling from the inspector, and it comes out that he has in fact fired Eva Smith, as we've already been through. So he's then told that he has to tell a little bit of the story, and it kind of comes out what happened. And so I wanted to focus a little bit on the wording of what he says about the firing of Eva Smith in this next little section. So you've got it up on the PowerPoint there for yourselves. So Mr. Burling says, "I went down myself and told them to clear out, and this girl, Eva Smith, was one of them. She'd had a lot to say, far too much. She'd had to go." At which point Gerald sort of supports him in this and says, well, you couldn't have done anything else. There's no other alternatives, as if to suggest. So I wanted to focus on this a little bit. Firstly, maybe just to think a little bit about some of the choices that Priestley makes in the play as well. It's quite significant and purposeful that he does actually choose a factory of women to be working for him, because actually at the time in 1912 most of the workforce would have been men, and actually still in 1945 most of the workforce would have been men. But it's quite significant that he's chosen to have Mr. Burling's factory largely employing so many women as seamstresses working on the machines in his factory. And I think this is quite deliberate in the sense that it makes the play about not just about class but about gender as well, and there's several other things that we've touched on. Gender is important in the play, so it makes sure that the position of working class women in particular were highlighted, and that's quite significant for this time as well, because in 1912 women wouldn't yet have had the vote, and so when we come on to look at this quote in a minute, I want you to think about the fact that the suffragette movement was happening, but there was still a long way to go with that. And by the time the play would have come out in 1945, there would have been significant advancements there in roles of women, as we've talked about before, women taking on men's jobs in the absence of men in the war, etc. So there would have at least been progress there, and therefore there would have been a lot more focus on the idea of women's voices in society. Also, we've got to remember the idea that he chooses in the play deliberately to have Eva Smith as an offstage character. So that's really important in the sense that the whole play is about her. She's essentially the main character, and yet she's never actually on stage. No one actually plays her. So therefore, all of that we learn about her is through the language of others, and through the tellings of others, and that puts us in quite a unique position when we're analysing and when you're studying. So if we look at how Mr. Burling actually describes it, then he talks about the idea of having a lot to say, and I think it's important to pick up on that idea that this could be symbolic metaphorically as well. It's not just about the fact that he thought she was a bit gobby and she was a ringleader of, she was kind of riling all the other girls up and getting them to sort of rise up and disobey his rules in any way. But it could also be symbolic further beyond that, of the idea that he felt that she had too much of a voice. She was, and this, that there's a hint of fear in what he's saying. She had a lot to say. It shows that this makes him, as a sort of upper middle class man, constantly upwardly mobile, it makes him nervous. The idea of a working class woman having a voice is unsettling to him, and it's as though it's something that must be stopped, that must be halted, because he finds it threatening in some way. And in the play we notice that Eva Smith is either defined as a worker, or later on she has to sort of change her identity, becoming a prostitute out of desperation. And so Priestley sort of highlights this lack of choice for working class women at the time, eventually leading to her only choice being to take her own life. But sort of shows to us how, as a working class woman, she has to kind of shift to fulfill or satisfy the wants and needs of the bourgeois classes. She has to fit in with and survive the best way she can by fitting to serve them. And when she tries to speak out for herself, or to try and become upwardly mobile, just as Burling has been, it's seen as unacceptable. They see it as threatening their position. So you could zoom in on that intensifier there far too much. She's got too much of a voice. And that would be a really nice contextual thing to bring in, with the fact that there were lots of strikes and sort of that had been put down quite violently, or people trying to speak out about perhaps the position of women, or the position of the working classes wanting more pay. And this idea of it was too much, as if they were stepping over their place in some way. And as hopefully you remember, there's quite a few other points in the play where that's referred to as well. Mrs. Burling later on talking about, women and a woman of her position, when she calls herself Mrs. Burling at the charity later on. But that's something to discuss for another day. But it's certainly a theme that runs through the play, this idea that they should know their place. There's the metaphor of the wall that comes up quite a few times. This idea Sheila saying you shouldn't build up a wall between us. But I think the older Burlings do want a wall. They believe that wall should be intact, and that the working classes shouldn't try to break down that barrier and try to get to where they are in some way. And then finally, this idea she had to go. If we kind of zoom in on the language there, there's this sense of inevitability to it. There's almost as though he has no choice. She was threatening my position. She had to go. I can't have someone threatening my low labour costs and threatening my profit. I had no choice. And again, it's this horrible ideology that the characters in the play construct in order to protect themselves. You couldn't have done anything else. Well, he absolutely could have done something else. He could have stood up for her. He could have been a champion of women like Eva Smith. He could have tried to help her. When he says he couldn't have done anything else, it's a sense, well, not without threatening his own profits, which he's not prepared to do. So everything is so self-serving and focused only on him, with the horrible sort of sycophantic Gerald sucking up to him there and trying to show that he agrees as well. So yeah, ugh, Gerald.
Oh gosh.
Cut in somebody before I start going on about Gerald.
We can't get started on Gerald, but I think that pronoun you, actually, when you think of from the audience of 1945, well, actually, like you said, Mrs. Marshall, the direct address there, he could have. And they always use that word to describe her as a girl, and it often, conjures this idea of vulnerability, and actually how much they could have actually helped this woman that eventually, because she is in her 20s. To call her a girl, I think it's more to do with this idea of her being vulnerable, that she ends up in the world of prostitution, which is, really tragic. Miss Harris, I'm just going to move on to your quote, because it's the last one.
Okay, everyone. So I'm going to whiz through this. So Mr. Burling said his piece to the inspector, and Sheila comes in and starts piping up, wanting to know what's happened. So there's a bit of an interaction between the inspector and Sheila. So he says there are a lot of young women living in that sort of existence in every city and big town in this country, Miss Burling. If there weren't, the factories wouldn't know where to look for cheap labour. Ask your father. And then Sheila pipes up with, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. And this is a really pivotal moment for Sheila. Sheila and Eric, being the younger characters, Priestley uses those characters to drive society forward and kind of be the beacon of hope for the younger generation that are going to carry forward this message of socialism into future generations and future years. So looking at this quote then, I'm going to look specifically at a couple of bits. Like Miss Wan's already said, so I'm not going to kind of jabber on and repeat what she's already said, but girls has, you know, connotations of vulnerability. Sheila sees this, whereas Mr. Berlin sees a chance to exploit them. Because they, you know, the young, the vulnerable, they don't have a voice, with gender being an issue and gender equality, he sees to exploit that. The inspector sees it as a chance to, as Mrs. Marshall said, you know, be a champion for them, help them, get society to recognise that there's injustice between the genders and a big gap in terms of equality. But Sheila sees it not just at the vulnerable and the chance to exploit them, but she sees the humanity in them. She sees that the workforce are vulnerable and how the capitalists have exploited them. Because her father groups these women together and calls them cheap labour. So he sees them purely as cogs in a machine. He sees them as disposable, replaceable. He treats and views his workforce in a very cold and clinical manner. He doesn't see them as human beings. You know, probably because the working class, but also because the women, and as Mrs. Marshall said, they don't have a voice or anyone to stick up for them. So the fact that Mr. Berlin calls them cheap labour, Sheila kind of fights back with this and says, well, no, they're not. The people, they're human, like just like we are. But also there's a reference to gender here, the fact that he calls them girls and cheap labour, she calls them people. Priestley was a big supporter of women's rights. Obviously, by 1945, they would have had the vote, the suffragette movement and such. So Sheila views, Priestley's views are coming through in Sheila, and he sees them as equal to men because they are human to their people. I think this is also a really important bit for Sheila because it's foreshadowing Sheila's change. It's the kind of first little tidbit that we get of her, that she has the ability to change, unlike the older characters, like a mother and father. Finally then, just the use of the adjective cheap. Miss Wan's already touched on this. Berlin sees them as cheap because he's prioritising minimising costs, and that kind of harkens back to his the big speech in before the inspector arrives with for higher costs and lower prices or something like that. But again, another definition of it is if something's cheap, it's of little worth. So Berlin views these women and his workforce of little importance. He doesn't see them as being important, and more so, he doesn't see them as human beings. He, you know, the language that Mr. Berlin and Gerald and Mrs. Berlin use throughout the play dehumanize Eva Smith, whereas the inspector does the exact opposite and wants to give them a voice, wants people to view them as human beings. Has anyone got anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's great.
I think you did a great job there, Miss Harrison.
Fabulous.
Hopefully you've all got your notes written down on the sheets that we'll send you along with this session. What are we covering next week? I think it'll be Sheila's role in the death of the inspector. So we're going to look into a bit more into Sheila, and then we're going to see how each character is responsible as the sessions go on. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. Sorry about my really long pause at one point, everybody.
That's okay.
I was very confused. I think it's the lockdown. It's done strange things. But you know, you can tune in for more unpredictable long pauses next week.
Pause is always effective. as are the
Yeah,
dashes.
I was just going for
Dramatic.
an impression of solidity and massiveness.
Yeah, I felt like it was very weighty.
Yeah, it worked.
All right, okay, guys.